Hello, and welcome to Optimize, the podcast for problem solvers. If you work in facilities and building operations, you know the job isn't about maintaining the status quo, but it's about solving problems. Every day brings something new, unexpected, and often urgent, especially to those that occupy our buildings. On this podcast, we sit down with operations leaders who live that reality every day. We talk about the challenges they're facing, the decisions they're making, and how they're using data and technology to solve problems at scale. Today, I'm joined with Eric Graham, founder and CEO at CrowdComfort. Eric will be my co-host in efforts here around the podcast, interviewing leaders. But he has a really awesome story to tell. Eric has built a career helping facilities team gain better visibility, respond to issues faster, and to really make smarter decisions that have huge budget impacts. And so I'm really excited about our conversation today and just wanted to welcome you. Hi, Eric. How are you doing today?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on, Chris.
Yeah, this is going to be really great. And, I think first and foremost, Eric, you have a really great kind of origin story. If we're kind of bringing it into like superheroes and villains, you have worked in kind of energy tech for a number of years, but then, kind of transitioned into other areas of the building, right? And other the things that really impact all the work that gets done in those buildings. So can you take me through kind of that origin story, kind of what drew you to facilities, buildings, operations technology, and how has that evolved as you've worked with more and more customers at CrowdComfort?
Yeah, no, thanks. And I've been involved in building construction and management and architecture my entire life. My father was an architect. I actually went into architecture school out of high school. I decided not to pursue a career as an architect, but I did end up spending a lot of time in my career in the building energy technology space and bringing new things into buildings that help, better manage the energy, help them be more sustainable, provide better experiences for occupants from an energy perspective and beyond. CrowdComfort sort of emerged out of that process through a hackathon that was put on by the White House and the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, and a bunch of companies were sponsoring that. I was there with an organization that was sponsoring it at the time. The idea for CrowdComfort emerged during an ideation session with the deputy CTO for the White House. And it just kind of clicked with me immediately. Why don't we tap into people and smartphones to unlock new kinds of energy data around, especially starting with thermal comfort, were people comfortable in buildings? And that's led us to where we are today, almost 14 years later.
Now, I know a lot of your background was on kind of energy, right? And energy consumption and making sure that we're managing our budgets really well there. As CrowdComfort has gone way more into the kind of frontline visibility, right? The people that are doing things like maintenance and custodial and inspections and things like that. Can you take me a little bit through kind of why that's a missing gap today for a lot of organizations, and what do you think are some of the big ahas that you've seen there?
Well, again, being involved in architecture and construction and the building of spaces, there's always been a sort of disconnect between the actual physical structure and then the people who occupy and or manage that structure. In fact, there's really great, BIM models that are designed as you think about building a building. But once the building is built, there's kind of a handoff, and that stuff just sort of melts away. It's almost like drawings in a drawer that get put away for the eons, right? And what CrowdComfort is doing is kind of bringing that piece of that operational management piece that involves the human experience and what people are doing in the needs of those people who occupy those buildings, the employees of big organizations, Fortune 500 companies, school districts, universities. These are living and breathing spaces that we're trying to bring sort of that frontline, employee experience and or, the people who are actually performing these tasks into light and bringing data into that part of that whole equation.
So when we think about that, and it's really interesting, I think, when I've started working here, like now I'm going into buildings and seeing, right? And actually seeing kind of what's been neglected, what's been done really well, right? And I think it's often misunderstood area there. And so when you think about kind of data and what that represents to those operations, right? The people in the field, the managers of those teams, and then ultimately the leaders that are managing the budgets. What are some of the big, KPIs that you kind of look for, and you've seen be really impactful for the organizations that are
Yeah.
starting to capture that data?
Yeah, I think transparency is the first big ROI, especially when it comes to the cleaning of buildings. This when we developed the cleaning map product, we thought it was more, in response to COVID to give building occupants a better sense of what's being cleaned where and when, right? What we discovered, it was more of like, are people doing what I'm paying them to do? Are we getting our money's worth for the contracts that we have signed with all these vendors and all these people who are supposed to do this work? And when I relate it back to like the energy days, the energy, career that I've had, where we were getting information on every kilowatt hour and every therm of gas and every possible measurable thing. The cleaning of the buildings was like, there's no meter on the building at all. There's no information. And when we dug deeper into it, we realized that the cost of cleaning these spaces was like 2x the cost of putting the energy into those same buildings. So it's like, wait a minute, how do we get better information here? And it also has evolved to where people in these custodial tasks are frontline workers. They're making sure these spaces are safe and comfortable and occupiable, right? But they haven't been brought into the digital world from a workforce perspective. So a lot of what we're doing is like empowering individuals to be able to use technology to demonstrate the hard work they're doing every day. And that allows us to do really interesting and cool things around how we reward them and how we can say thank you to the people who are really carrying that load. And it also helps you find out which ones aren't really carrying the load, and maybe you should be better off doing something else. So that's been a big part of the evolution and the return on investment on its face. There's a lot built into what I just said in terms of an ROI, right? Of metrics. There's lots of metrics tied in there. But as you go deeper, then it starts to get even more interesting, I think.
Yeah. And, I think it's really interesting kind of the evolution on data, right? We had, the clipboard on the bathroom door for years, right? A lot of organizations still have that. But
Most do.
yeah, most do, right?
Virtually all.
And so the question is like now if we're capturing digitally, right? The custodian or the cleaning team member, what they've cleaned, where they've cleaned it, at what time, and who it is, we start to build this data set that then now I think we're seeing a lot of customers start to get a lot more information that helps them actually start to think about their strategies a little bit differently. And we're starting to add square footage data, right, to that room location. And so to your point there, I think one of the things is, accountability is a big area there, but accountability also brings recognition, right? If you're doing your job in a good way, you're doing that. But now, because we now have all that information, stuff like workloading, how much square footage should we give towards an employee? How much can they cover? How can we manage that when we lose team members or bring team members on? And how is that a living, breathing kind of scope of work with our teams is really, really interesting. And I know, you've seen a lot of good, return on investment with some of the teams that are struggling with budgets right now and struggling with how do we actually look at that scope of work and maintain it because we can't do the same thing we did, 5 years ago, right? Because
Yeah.
we are down people and the same scope, right? And so what have you seen in terms of discussions with executives there around how they're using that data?
Yeah, I mean, you know, a lot of times we're bringing a software system, but the software system embedded in it is a whole new way of doing operations. And we are in essence consulting our clients on how to implement a new way of doing things and a change management process. And where you start to immediately find improvements is you're giving people time back in their day. You're also empowering one individual as a manager to be able to do the work of two managers in the existing process, right? And we found that with very, very large school districts. We see it in big organizations across the board who are throwing bodies at the problem because, nobody has information. So when questions are asked, you're invariably like fingers get pointed or people have to dig, they have to ask a lot of questions. It leads to a lot of frustration, both on people managing, people on the ground who are actually doing the work, and the people asking those questions. Everyone's frustrated by that process, which, is not ideal. And it costs time and money doing those things. We've been able to see a 50% reduction in the number of managers required to manage the same level of tasks. So that's like layer number one is like improve your management process. Number two is then start to measure and deliver specific lists of what people are supposed to be doing, which helps them be accountable, helps them know what do people expect me to be doing, right? It lets the managers know what and deliver what do I expect you to do today or tomorrow or every week or every month. And then, once you start digging into that, then you discover opportunities to assign people more effectively. And we've seen about a 30% increase in total capacity by way of just better managing that whole process. So down to the people on the ground, to the managers, where you're getting probably you can eliminate almost half of the management overhead. And then the senior level people are getting, their jobs are more efficient. They know where to apply their time and energy. And then they have data, they're armed with data to report up to the very senior leadership of what are the things they need, where do they want to invest, where can they de-invest, where can they be more efficient. That's the process that we bring to the table. And it's a lot more than just software. It's a software with a process.
Yeah. So let's decouple that a little bit. You mentioned a lot of things there. I think first and foremost, one of the things that we look at is communication, right? Communication's broken. Communication of what work's been done, right? Every day,
Mhm.
communication of what our strategy is to an occupant or, in a K through 12 thing, K through 12 environment, looking at principles, right? And not knowing what's cleaning's happening or what's happening there. I think we've seen a lot of really interesting things communication wise with using, our mobile phones to be able to record work has just enabled people to have what they need to do the work. I know you've seen some really interesting stories about kind of broken equipment and other kind of work orders and the speed at which custodians really help there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, communication is a huge piece of the equation. It's just sort of getting everybody on the same page, like where is information flowing about what's happening, and then, tying that to specific tasks and setting up automated communication so that when someone is not only performing the work they're doing, but if someone's coming behind that and checking the quality, that a principal or a manager is automatically notified of that quality result. How did it score? That someone was actually there on that day, even though they didn't see the principal knows, the school was visited, what the results were. They can also over time start to see how often is it visited? Are the schools being checked at the level that they're supposed to, or not? It creates transparency in all directions.
Yeah, and it's really interesting on the quality metric because, I think that's always the part, right? If we're looking at our custodial operations, how are we measuring it, right? And,
Mhm.
I think are we measuring it to the scope of work, right? The everyday stuff that needs to happen. Somebody needs to be there who needs to do that. And then the quality of that work, right? One of the things that I think is interesting as we like learn and evolve this is, there's plenty of frameworks, right? For how do you rate quality? APPA has, a really and especially on the K through 12 and university
Mhm.
side. ISSA has a number of other standards around, how long it takes to clean and what the quality level should look like. What we've seen though, like, is that a lot of organizations also have that quality be a kind of a point in time, right? Quality data is a point in time. It's, hey, I've gone in this day, once a week or once a month, and I've rated the quality and it was good, right? And then there's the aspect, well, is it good every other time? Or when was that equality, or did they know that a quality check was going to happen? And so when you think about kind of like marrying those two data sets together, like where do you think the good equilibrium is for organizations and how they should achieve their quality goals along with the scope goals?
Yeah, and there's a couple other planes there. One is like who's actually measuring it because it's subjective at some level because it's a human perception, right? And some people, some school teachers just rate, everyone gets an A, right? And others are like, nobody gets more than a C, right? So there's a little bit of that. But then, is the person doing the rating a pure third party? Is it a manager of people and they're rating the quality of the people that they're managing? Is it, someone who works for the client, like an employee of that organization, or is it someone outside of that? So there's different layers, and we use the technology to help distinguish those differences. And as you develop data over time, then you see patterns. So certain people, are more of the C rather than the A kind of grader, and then you can normalize for that. And then you can also see, well, if you're an employee of the district that's hiring you versus the managers who's managing the employees that and responsible for that specific building, there's differences. And data, the more data we have, the more we can use that to normalize those outcomes on the quality side.
And I know also, I think to that point, we've also seen through like independent quality surveys around that just having that accountability piece also increases quality. So not only is it just, providing that feedback and those quality checks, but just by having a process in which you are reporting digitally that you've cleaned a space,
Yeah.
quality goes up, right? Because people know that they're looking at that data, they know that it's happening. And so there's,
Or
also
someone's
that
paying
piece.
attention. Someone's
Yeah.
actually taking a quick look at what's happening. And yeah, in massive footprints, it's really hard to be able to keep track of so many people in so many spaces. But if you have a system that like makes it like it's going to happen, it's happening. It's, people are going to be paying more attention to the details.
Yeah. So, I think we've established, data is important. And I know with a number of our customers, like this is the first time they've really had a comprehensive data set that's centralized, where communication is centralized and kind of managing it. That being said, I think one of the big questions, right, for most people trying to get more digital in how they do their data, especially around custodial operations, is how do we actually start to enable technology in those environments, right? Typically, we're working with frontline team members who might not be the most technology savvy. We might be working with multiple languages at times. And also for some of these, large districts or large enterprises that want to go across this, it's a big undertaking of the mobile device, giving managers data, how do they use the data on a daily basis. So what would you have in terms of advice for somebody that is trying to stick their toe in, right? And then kind of leap and get to that perspective where they're starting to actually look at real-time data to manage that custodial operations. What can they do to kind of accelerate that?
Yeah. I mean, with all this talk about AI and everything else that's happening in the world, and AI is very valuable and we can use it in different ways with the data we have. But we're almost at a point in time when it comes to the frontline worker where it's like it was, I don't know, 40 years ago when companies were deciding should they buy a desktop computer for their employees, right? That's where we are in the evolution of this level of technology is like, we need to make the decisions to empower the workforces. If you want good information, you want good compliance on dollars that you're spending and understanding, and also be able to appreciate people for hard work being done that's not just subjective, like someone has a good personality, so that's why they won an award, but actual data. They have to invest in this, right? And there's been a resistance to that because I think they haven't felt that number one, that there was a way to actually get information that was useful in this area because it's all human input data. It's not data you can ping. Like in the energy business, we could ping sensors that give us readings every millisecond if we want, right? But with people inputting data, it has to be really thoughtful. It has to be easy to use. You have to be able to make that data accessible or make the data arrive in a really easy way, but also validate that it's real.
Yeah. And, I think there's a lot of really interesting, areas there. I think it's making it so language isn't a barrier, right? Making it really easy to make sure that like imagery and The steps around that process are really simple. I think there's a lot of things that, we've had conversations with, unions on the custodial side. And how do we actually, why is this a benefit? Right, to the frontline workers versus like a more big brother activity, right? With sensors and with other technologies, tracking GPS is probably a no go, right? You don't want to get into those different data privacy issues. And so, how do we actually make it so it's like, hey, you do your work every day, right? Like, you should have a record of that. Everybody should have a record of that. They should know the quality that you do, right?
Yeah.
And how do we do that? And I think one of the big things that we've seen a lot, and it's been probably one of the best parts of our days in working with customers, is that recognition program that you kind of mentioned earlier. Can you take us a little bit through kind of, how organizations are actually starting to get like, not only qualitative data, right, on who's good, right, hey, they're a great worker, but the quantitative data and how they're using that for recognition programs?
Yeah. Yeah. And, you started this question with, how we interact with unions and like, how do they view it? And I think it all boils down. We've had great experience with unions and I think a lot of that lies in the people that are working hard. They want to showcase the work they're doing and they absolutely love the idea that they're getting a little bit extra reward, a little bit extra thank you through their day because this is an area of work where people just don't get any respect. They don't get called out and they don't easily get thank yous. They just get, oh, there's a spill over here or that trash wasn't emptied or that kind of thing. So there's so much opportunity there. And to me, as the CEO of this company, the custodians are our users, especially with cleaning maps. That product, it's the custodians that are our customers. Even though they're not paying for it, it's like their organizations are paying for it. But we care deeply about them. We want to help them demonstrate that work, show the hard work they're doing. And then the best part of my job is giving the rewards. Like I love going into different organizations around the country and giving out, awards, whether it's with gift cards or whether it's just plaques or trophies or whatever. But it's a way for us to help organizations make it easy and non-subjective, data-driven. And they really appreciate the idea of being able to say thank you and have it be done in a way that's not like, wait a minute, I'm rewarding the wrong behavior because so-and-so is getting the rewards because they have a good personality, but they don't do their job. It's like we remove all that complexity.
Yeah, and I think it's a big issue as well within the industry as we are looking at kind of the average age of somebody that's in cleaning, right? And it's getting higher, right? And so how do we retain folks from going into other industries? How do we retain that? Retention is a huge issue on that side, and so recognition goes a long way to maintaining
Yeah.
the best workers, but also like looking at the data and seeing who those are,
Yeah.
and making sure that you're doing things, whether that's awards, whether that's promotions, whether that's training opportunities, or whatever that is, being able to have a data set to actually identify those folks becomes really, really important.
Yeah.
You mentioned AI earlier, and it's becoming way more mainstream. Where do you think AI is headed? Where do you think that's going to help us in terms of that daily operations piece? As we've mentioned, kind of the it's very human driven, right? And so, how do we use AI in such a human driven industry? Is a big question. And so, I'd be
Yeah.
curious, kind of your thoughts on kind of what the next, you know, 2 to 3 years looks like with using those tools.
Well, yeah, as I mentioned before, we are at the human side of data collection. Like we are getting information from people, right? That's where we live and breathe. Whether it's the employee of a major corporation or a principal or a teacher in a school district or professor in a university, we're getting data from them. The thing that AI can do for us is take the data that we're bringing in and help organize it and understand it in ways that takes a lot more, human capital to try to decipher. Now, in our process, we are very adept at the analytics layer, like taking the data we're bringing in from people and making it actionable, understandable, measurable, right? How quickly are people responding to coffee requests in a workplace? Like we can give you that instantaneously. You can see it in a graphical format that allows you to understand it immediately. But when you start bringing in millions and, hopefully at some point it's billions of data points every day, every week, every month, AI can help you look at that in different ways that, trying to build the analytics by itself might be more complicated than or we might not even know that, hey, there's a way to look at this that AI would point out to us. So those are some of the things. I mean, I think image recognition is something I think could be used more and more in the future with our technology because we do get lots of images. And if images are required when, post cleaning or doing something, then there's more you can do with that. Obviously, natural language processing that can help in the data collection side, translating human voice into data, into information, those kinds of things.
Yeah, no, and I know like when I have had conversations with you and others, it's, how do we start to take some of the things that we're doing every day to impact the quality and the, um, meeting scope every day, right? So it's like, how do we actually like create, a virtual custodial manager that helps to train a custodial manager to maintain their team, to look at data, to identify training opportunities, to make sure that the team is fully up leveled, right?
Yeah,
Things around workloading, right? And looking at square footage and, saying, hey, like we have adjustments to our team. This is what we have now. How do you suggest we deploy this, right? For the best records when it comes to cleanliness, scope, and elsewhere. And so I think there's a lot of really interesting things that come from AI, hopefully being able to take our strategy and start to give us suggestions so that we can be really nimble, right, in the future
right.
to whatever comes our way.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the performance data that we have around, especially at the management layer, we know who's performing well, and a lot of how they're performing well is tied to their communication. And so, you know, looking at the data set that they have, the people working in the field, what they're doing, and then optimizing for how are the top performing folks communicating to their teams. And then rather than make it more of a process, they have to sit down and actually create the content that says, hey, these are the areas and buildings that what's going on here, what's going on there. You know, Top performing managers are actually looking at this and then asking those questions. But we could streamline that process leveraging AI so that we're suggesting, hey, why don't you share this information with these people and just hit send, and take all that time back and automate the process so that not only the folks doing that work could do it more efficiently, but we could then replicate it with other managers who are, a little lower performing and help them perform at a higher level because their communication capacity increases.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of potential, right? But it's all about capturing the data first and then looking at and how do we actually start to use that data in a way to save time, right? Save
Yeah,
budget,
right.
to understand that. I have three more questions here, just, quickly. But first and foremost, just, when we're thinking about kind of these industries, right? We're seeing a lot of challenges. So K through 12 budgets are becoming a challenge. They have a lot of deferred maintenance. Their buildings are old and their infrastructure is older. And so that the work that they're doing in the buildings actually is even more impactful because cleanliness, maintenance work, it really makes an impact. Higher ed, is seeing similar things. And then, we have other industries like life sciences where like compliance and, things like cleanliness and, maintenance work, it impacts productivity really greatly. When you think about kind of all the industries, as they're looking at reshaping their operations, what do you think is going to be happening in the next like 3 to 5 years for the ones that really are successful, right? In terms of, providing for students and staff or providing for their workers.
Yeah. Well, I would use, our largest client is, the fourth largest school district in the country. And we've been able to save them $50 million dollars a year by doing two things, which I talked about a little bit earlier. But the first is helping them rationalize their management staff so that their management staff is right sized and reduced based on the ability to leverage technology for these managers to do their work. And that was $20 million dollars worth of savings. And then the second $30 million dollars of savings are being derived from making the team more effective the people on the ground doing the work, making them more effective and having them, because they're more effective and they have more direct oversight and management and guidance, they're delivering greater capacity. And it's measured down to, the right amount of square footage that those people are supposed to cover, but they're covering more of it every day. Because in the past, when no one's really able to watch effectively, you just lose time. The time gets sort of absorbed into the past very easily.
Yeah, no, it's interesting kind of thinking about that because, I think every custodial operation starts with scope, right? How many buildings, how many square feet, like what type of cleaning we're trying to do. And then it's like, well, based off of data, this is how you optimize it. None of that stuff happens on a daily basis, right? Like, going 100% on that, there's probably days that you hit it, days you don't, when you lose staff, when people are sick, all that stuff starts to go about that, but they don't necessarily go back and reorganize that on a consistent
Right.
basis, right? It might be
Right.
like a 5-year cycle where they're like looking back at scope and doing that. And so in between that time, if you don't have data, what are you going to do? Right? Like, how are you going to manage that? Especially when on an annual budget season, you might lose folks. Right. And
Right.
so
Right.
I think that's a really good example of just, there are forced, consolidations of budgets and operations that are happening right now. How do you actually, with that forced consolidation, make it work? Right. And
Yeah.
improve quality and maintain quality across those districts. It's a really tough thing to do if you don't have the data around it because you're just not going to get the same personnel, the same
Right.
number of people, right? In that you want. And that becomes a big issue.
I mean, technology has been advancing our human capacity for decades, right? It's just we're in an area where it hasn't because it hasn't been present. The clipboard on the back of the bathroom door is a great example. The Olympics are about to start, right? There's going to be how many world records are going to be hit during this Olympics? How many times, how many years have we been like having Olympics every 4 years and people are setting world records every single time? Right? The ability to hit world records is about technology, right? It's swimmers, how much more efficient did they become when they started wearing these like super high tech bathing suits, right? And that allows them to squeeze that extra second in the 100-meter swim or whatever. Crowd Comfort is that swimsuit.
Yeah, yeah, it's all about, giving clarity, right, to it and, as we've talked about a lot of different things so that you can then start to optimize. And that's
Right.
the area there. That's why we named the podcast that. It's all about optimization because, again, we're always going to have to do more with less, right? That's a common
Right.
area there. But you can't always just do that, right? You have to
Right.
optimize that and you have to have a process in place to manage that.
Well, and,
So,
and, and some optimizations, right, are incremental. Like, by the time you get to the swimsuit that's happening in this Olympics is probably just a tiny, tiny bit better than the one that was in the last Olympics, right? But then there's certain things that optimize in vast chunks, right? That change the dynamic of how things work. The internet being invented changed the steam engine, right? Those things are massive changes in optimization and efficiency and it's human productivity, human growth, right? And I think where we are in the fields we operate, we're at the steam engine level. We're at that optimization of we're changing things so dramatically that there's massive, it's not incremental change that we're talking about. It's 50%, 30% change in performance and efficiency that we're going for and that our clients are seeing.
yeah. So, final question, ask everybody this, but when we're looking at this, what advice do you give to an operation leader that might be listening about, what can they do to start, right? In terms of starting to modernize their strategy, start to understand their data better. What should they be starting to look at? What advice would you give them?
I mean, obviously, if you want to start implementing a crowd comfort process, you can start small, right? You don't need to start with your entire organization to understand how well this will help. And just about every customer we have has always started with some handful of buildings or some part of a portfolio of real estate and then tested it. We provide, here's the ROI that we think you can achieve. And then let's test that with a smaller subset and see. And oftentimes we find more efficiencies, more opportunities than we start with. But, we've gotten pretty good at this. So we have a long list of like all the different ways in which a client can receive and achieve an ROI. But it's which ones apply to each client is the part that we help them figure out and then help them build a process that works for them.
Fantastic. Great. Well, I mean, those were all the questions I had. Eric, it's been awesome talking with you. I think every time I talk to you, I learn a little bit more, right? And I think it's always great to kind of understand not only kind of what's happening today, but also the vision of where it can go, right? And that's, I think, a journey, but it's also a community to really start to push the boundaries of what we're doing. So really appreciate you joining today, and we'll look forward to the next episode of the podcast as we move forward.